interesting in many ways, both from the perspective of what it offers us and what the path is. So to begin with, I think before we discuss the path to a destination, it probably would help us to define the destination. That what does freedom mean? What does absolute freedom mean? So what is your sense when somebody talks about freedom? And absolute, I guess, is a qualifier. It just establishes it to a greater extent. But when somebody talks about freedom, what's the connotation? What does it mean to have freedom?
With freedom comes responsibility.
Okay. That's a very interesting take, that the understanding of freedom is that it is accompanied with responsibility. Thank you, Shivani.
It would probably mean without restrictions.
Without
like not being restricted or restrained about anything.
Not being restrained. Yes. Thank you. That's a very conventional understanding of freedom. When somebody says I'm free, that means the extent of restraint or the degrees of restraint are mitigated.
Another connotation of freedom for me is freedom of choice, being able to make a choice by yourself.
Okay. So understanding is good or bad choice. It's your choice.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Piyali.
Freedom is free from anxiety and miseries.
And be happy all the time.
Who said that? Be happy all the time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yes, that's again very interesting. That freedom is kind of being equated with happiness. That freedom results in happiness. So there is absence and presence, because happiness is the presence of something, and anxieties and worries, that is the absence. So one definition of freedom is the absence of all these things. Other understanding of freedom, which is not very intuitive, is the presence of something, which is the presence of happiness. Thank you.
Being disciplined is freedom.
जोर से बोलिए प्रभु, सुनाई नहीं दे रहा.
I'm saying like being disciplined is freedom. Like when you're disciplined, you have like more time to do more stuff.
So that's kind of like a path to freedom. I think what you're saying is that if you follow discipline, because discipline in itself is the opposite of freedom, right? Discipline is, I ask you to get up at 4 o'clock every day morning. So that's impinging on your freedom. Now you don't have a choice to get up at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock or 3 o'clock. I'm saying that you get up at 4 o'clock. So that's the discipline. But the point you're making is, which we can explore, is that by following such discipline, it ultimately results in more freedom. Right? That's what you're saying, Vikas Prabhu, right?
Everything under our control, probably, like whatever I want, I desire, everything that should happen in the way I want.
Okay. So that's the freedom to desire, or freedom to... Can you expand on that, Ravi Prabhu?
Yes, like everything that I desire that should happen. That is the freedom. Like if I want to fly, I should be able to fly. And if But still, that is just happening what we want.
Okay. Okay.
I think freedom, is definitely to the ability to make choices for yourself, but with reasonable restrictions. Because there is no such thing as absolute freedom. Because if it infringes upon others' choices, ability to make choices, then that's not probably acceptable to others. So there is no such thing as absolute freedom. Comes with some restrictions. There is, of course, these reasonable restrictions.
Yeah, you're talking about reality. So what I'm talking is just, design. Reality, what you said is true, because our freedom obviously restricts others. But we want unlimited freedom. We are independent of other owners.
So one's person's freedom might impinge on other person's freedom, right? So one person may say that I should be free, when I first moved in my townhome, I did not mow my lawn, so I said I should be free not to mow my lawn. And then they served me a notice saying that you either mow your lawn or we'll mow it for you and charge you $75 for it. So after that, I started mowing my lawn. So I think the point I guess Sunil Prabhu and Ravi Prabhu are making is that there's freedom of desire, that you can desire that everything I desire happens. And then the reality is that one's man's freedom can impinge on another man's freedom. So the notion of everybody having absolute freedom is probably not practical, because by nature freedom would cross boundaries, and your freedom would restrict others. So thank you, all very good points. So there was one point that was made 2 times, which is very, very interesting to me. It kind of takes my thunder away, because I was hoping to get to that point towards the end of the lecture, but since it's already been made, so I'll call it out and we'll have a discussion on that and the other factors. That essentially freedom is the freedom to make a choice. That I choose to do one thing or other, and the more avenues I have to make a choice, the more I would consider myself to be free. So the choice is in terms of like the freedom of speech is that I should be able to say what I want to. Now again, the point is that so empirically we see that at least in the United States, one of the most jealously guarded freedom is that of speech. Right? It's the First Amendment to the Constitution, and in almost all the cases where people are taken to court for so-called violation of freedom of speech, they are the ones who generally win, because the Constitution, it goes to great lengths to guarantee freedom of speech. Now within that, of course, are subcategories of that. If you're saying something that is hurtful to a particular religion, or if you are saying something that is characterized as libel or defamation, they are subject to your being punished. But overall, even those are small nuances. The freedom of speech is very jealously guarded because of because of the history of the U.S. When the U.S. became free, the first thing it established was the right to protest. So the freedom of speech was actually the right to protest, the right to speak up against the government, and then it became more widespread. So I wanted to take a couple of examples from Srila Prabhupada's pastimes to talk about, to introduce the notion of freedom from both the conventional perspective and the spiritual perspective. So when Prabhupada was young, when he was in college, so that was the time when the freedom movement was very strong in India. So India was not free at that time. It was ruled by the Britishers, and Mahatma Gandhi was there, and he was establishing the whole notion of freedom. Srila Prabhupada, he was in college at the time. He was doing his bachelor's, and he was an ardent follower of Mahatma Gandhi. So much so that when he graduated from college, at the convocation ceremony, when the names of the students are called out for them to receive the degree, Mahatma Gandhi had basically given this guidance to refuse the degree from the British government, because he had recognized the fact that the British government had subverted the education system to create a slavish mentality amongst the Indians. So they had recognized the fact that Indians by nature were very much favorable to education, gave a lot of importance to it. And this, of course, comes from our Brahmanical culture. But they understood that education was very important for Indians. So one of the first things they had done was to anglicize it. So all the good schools were run by the missionaries, who essentially were proxies for the government. And they were English education schools. So they were basically using that as a way to develop the notion of superiority of the Western culture, superiority of English. To some extent, we still have that mentality, even though it's been more than 75 years. It became a part of our psyche. Mahatma Gandhi was one of the first persons to see that and call that out. So Srila Prabhupada actually did not go to get his degree as a symbol of boycott, and he was naturally a leader. So he was exercising his leadership in this area. Then it so happened that one day one of his friends asked him to come with him and meet a sannyasi. And Srila Prabhupada, or Abhay as his name was at the time, he was very reluctant, because even though he was from a Vaishnava family, but he had noticed that most of the so-called Babajis and sannyasis, they were charlatans. They were either after money or worse. So he actually initially was hesitant, but the friend insisted. And he said, you should come. So they went, and they went into a small building. They went up the stairs, and there was a small, there was an opening. So in Indian houses at the time, the roofs were, in the roof there used to be a courtyard. And especially because the country is hot, so in the roof there used to be a small courtyard. And especially in summers, people would go and sit in that courtyard. People would sleep over there. So he went up the steps, went up to the courtyard and the roof, and there he saw a man looking. He was very, very intellectual, and he was in sannyasi clothes. He was bare-chested, thin, and then Prabhupada said that he looked at him and he was impressed by his intellect. That he obviously looked very, 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 very analytical and intellectual. So that person was Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. Then Prabhupada sat and heard him, and then there was a short conversation. So Prabhupada, because at that time was so much absorbed in the freedom for India, so when Bhaktisiddhanta was encouraging everybody to take to this path of spirituality, then Prabhupada actually raised his hand, and then he said that all that is fine, but first we must get freedom from the Britishers. That as long as we are a slave country, there is nothing much that we can do. So in order to even establish our own identity as a country, as a culture, we need to get freed from these foreigners. And then Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati said a very interesting thing to him. He said that what's the value of their freedom? That if you get freedom from them, then you will still be ruled by somebody else. So you will be ruled by your desires, you will be ruled by your senses. Ultimately, you will still be ruled by the onset of time, which means that ultimately you still don't have the freedom not to grow old and not to die. It was a very, very short conversation, and that changed Prabhupada's life. So it's interesting that we owe our spiritual experience to that conversation on freedom that happened, and this happened in 1918. The Prabhupada was 22 years old at the time, and yes, it happened in 1918. This conversation happened. And we are experiencing the impact of that conversation even today. Because of that, Srila Prabhupada, he began to contemplate deeply on the real meaning of freedom. Now, it took him 11 years to actually act upon it, which meant that after 11 years after that meeting, he formally became a disciple of Bhaktisiddhanta, and almost 40 years after that meeting, he actually acted upon it. But as it is said in Prabhupada's biography, Leelamrita, that all that time was in preparation of the action that would fructify because of this revelation. So the seed was sown, and it was being nurtured very, very carefully, to the point that it began to bear fruits. So even though we consider that the Hare Krishna movement started in 1965 when Prabhupada came to the US, but actually it started several decades before that, because of this discussion on freedom. And Prabhupada's if you go and look at lectures of Srila Prabhupada, this is one of the topic that Prabhupada talks about a lot. either he talks about it as part of his lectures, or he specifically talks about it. Because here I'm speculating a little bit, but perhaps because it was because of his Guru Maharaj's mercy that he could get the understanding of freedom, which was the beginning of his spiritual journey. So what is the freedom that we are talking about? Essentially speaking, and this may come or may not come, because I'm in the association of people who are introspective and advanced in their thoughts. But it came to me as a bit of surprise that actually there is no freedom. This notion of freedom is, like Prabhupada would say, is like trying to find water in a mirage. You look at a mirage, you think that there is a lake over there, but actually there is nothing. So actually there is no freedom. Now what does it mean that there is no freedom? So in order to understand that, let's take an example that we can, well, not personally relate to it, hopefully, but we can relate to it observationally. That what happens when a person is incarcerated. So when a person is put into jail, then the whole idea of putting him in jail is that now your freedom is taken away. But is that really true? Are the people who are not in jail, do they have a greater amount of freedom? The answer is not really. Because if you look at the people who are law-abiding citizens, the reason that they are not in jail is because they are law-abiding. What does that mean? What it means is that they choose to let go of their freedom to abide with the dictates of the legal system. So they are restricting their freedom voluntarily. And then there are a group of people who say, I don't want to be restrained by all these laws. To various degrees, people will disobey them. Some will say that I don't believe in paying taxes. They won't pay tax. Or some will say that I don't respect this distinction of property. So what's yours is mine. So they take with impunity. Or some will say that my needs are more than yours. So if you are an impediment in my pursuit, then I'm free to do what I want to. So they may be trying to exercise their freedom over there, and then as a result of it, they have to now submit themselves to a different set of rules and regulations. I still have a friend who had spent, he's a devotee, he had spent 10 years incarcerated. And then he was sharing with me that the one thing that they do in the prison system is that they attempt to regulate each and every moment that you have. So you get up at a certain time, you eat at a certain time, you play at a certain time, you sleep at a certain time. And then he was laughing and he was saying, not much different from ISKCON. Right, so you get up in the morning, do Mangal Aarti, chant 16 rounds. Now, you may have some freedom to eat wherever, but you can only eat a certain kinds of food. You can't eat another kind of food. Certain activities you can do, most of the activities you cannot. If you have to get up early, you have to sleep early. So then I said that, Prabhu, there must be some difference, because you would not have, so he came out, he took initiation, very, very prolific preacher right now. And then the point that he made is, there is a difference. There is a difference that I choose to do this. So that's what makes it relishable. That in both the situations, the freedom is heavily restricted. In one case, it is from without. In other case, it is from within. And the fact that I choose to surrender my freedom in this particular way, so there is no Krishna in this so far. This is just the freedom of choice that we have. So ultimately that's the only freedom that we have, is the freedom of choice. In California, I forget which temples, but Srila Prabhupada had a disciple, and he was always a little bit he had difficulty adjusting. So after some time he left the temple and he went away. Nobody knows where he went away. So once Srila Prabhupada was being driven around somewhere, his disciples pulled his car into a gas station to fill the car, and the person who was pumping gas was this disciple. So Prabhupada was Prabhupada. He was always happy. So he looked at him and said, "Oh, Hare Krishna, Hare Bol." So these were the days when there were not that many disciples. So Prabhupada knew all his disciples. And he says, whatever his name was, "Hare Krishna, how are you?" But this person was very defensive, in a way that he felt that he had betrayed Prabhupada or whatever. But he was very defensive for whatever reason. So Prabhupada was like, "Hare Krishna, how are you?" So he says that, "I'm actually good, I'm very happy, I'm actually free to do whatever I want." So the point he was making was that because he used to have a lot of trouble getting up in the morning for Mangal Aarti and trouble following the regulations. So he says, "At least I'm free to do whatever I want." And Prabhupada said, "Really? So you're free not to get old? You're free not to die anymore?" And he was quiet after that. So we may have small amounts of perceived freedom, but ultimately it's a zero-sum game. When we are getting freedom, we are trading freedom in other areas. If we are law-abiding, then we are trading our freedom to act as we want. And the freedom that we get is that we get to stay in our houses. We get to move wherever we want to. So we can now try and extend this notion to material and spiritual realms. So when we talk about absolute freedom, the term absolute generally comes in the context of spirituality. because in the material context, everything is relative. So we had some discussion about what is freedom. So in order to get an understanding of what is absolute freedom, one of the things that we can see is what is it that we don't have right now. So just like when a person is incarcerated, then there are certain things that the person lacks. And that is that person's definition of freedom. That I should be able to walk out, get into my car and drive to wherever I want. For that person, that is the understanding of freedom. I should be able to sleep anywhere. I should be able to eat at any time, get up at any time, sleep at any time. That is that person's definition of freedom. What is our definition of freedom? What is our definition of absolute freedom? Any thoughts? What does absolute freedom, the term absolute freedom, convey to us?
So let me make an attempt. I would agree that a lot of Prabhu said about that you said about the word choice. I think I would define freedom as the courage to be yourself first, whoever you are. I mean, obviously, you're going to be law-abiding. You're not going to be a mad person in terms of we got to keep to the right here. You come from India, we can't keep to the left. That's stupidity, right? That's not freedom. So I think within that framework, do you have a choice to be yourself, whoever you are? That's one. So one dimension. I think at a spiritual level, I would say, which gets you to that absolute freedom, are you free of all your senses? But that's where you're a slave to. That's where whatever little understanding I have about spiritual path, all the five senses. Are you a slave to the senses? Are you tied up to the senses? Or you're free of those senses? Obviously, people like Prabhupada in that level of, that highest level of attainment, I'm sure they attain that absolute freedom. They're not enslaved to anything at all. And that's where probably that whole consciousness, Krishna consciousness, just that absolute consciousness exists, nothing else. And that's where you kind of surrender, merge to that absolute. That's the ultimate freedom, absolute freedom. Nothing exists other than that Krishna consciousness. No senses, no attachment, no nothing. That's what my little understanding.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Yes, Lalji Prabhu.
Yeah, what my understanding of freedom is free from fear, because there's a kind of fear what will happen tomorrow, what happened this and so for my understanding, I would consider absolute freedom is free from any fear of even death.
Good, very good. Thank you, Prabhu.
So, Prabhu, my understanding is absolute freedom is just a concept. It does not actually exist for any of us who have come into this world as human beings. It's a concept which we can never experience.
So let me take you up on that, Piyali. So you're saying absolute freedom is just a concept for us as conditioned beings. What about for those who are liberated?
Those who are liberated in what sense? They're still bound by other constraints. They're still bound by old age. They're still bound by diseases. They're still bound by the laws of death. So what is this absolute freedom? So they have a framework in which they have to be, irrespective of what their state of mind or spirit is. That is why I say the concept of absolute freedom. When you use the word absolute, you change the whole paradigm. When you don't use the word absolute and you talk about freedom, I agree with what Lalji Prabhu and all are saying. Like, it's the freedom of the mind from many different things, freedom of this from other things. But the concept of absolute freedom with all degrees, in every aspect, on every axis, does not exist. That's my interpretation of it.
So when I was saying liberated, what I meant was that those who have been liberated from the material existence, so they're back in the spiritual plane.
Okay, that's why I qualified that, when we are human beings, there's no concept of absolute freedom.
Right, but my question still remains that what about in that plane? Now we don't have empirical observe. We are not able to observe, but
that plane. From what I hear from your teachings or from what is written in the Shastras, in that plane you have absolute freedom.
Okay, you were doing so well.
Sorry, I'm winging it?
I said you were doing so well.
But until you messed up in the last minute.
Until you messed up in the last minute. But I still want to hear from others. So thank you so much, Bhayahari. I think you're... very good. Thank you. We'll discuss more. Other thoughts?
Prabhuji, I think the freedom in the material world is like we have, in a limited framework, we have unlimited freedom. So we are chained by our karma. Within the boundaries of our karma, we have unlimited freedom to make our choices, to do what we want. And in the spiritual realm, like there also, our freedom is, I can say that unlimited because there is no restriction. But the only restriction that comes to my mind is like, we are free to think that we are, that freedom is not there. If you think, then we are in the material world. Then our framework is further limited. But as a jiva, like whatever maximum that is allowed, that is possible in spiritual world because Krishna is far superior. He is the one who gives freedom. He has the freedom to give us freedom also.
So that's a contradiction. So there's a contradiction in. So that's. Where is the noise coming? Can you mute yourself, Ravi Prabhu? Thank you. So I think in a way that's a contradiction in terms. So when you're saying that in the spiritual world there is absolute freedom, but unless you don't do things that will get you kicked out of the spiritual world, which by nature you're already violating the definition of absolute freedom. Absolute freedom means that you can absolutely do anything that you want. But does that mean that in the spiritual world you have the freedom to be envious of Krishna? Or do you have the freedom of being, of looking upon other people, other jivas, or other resources as objects of your personal enjoyment?
Here, Prabhuji, I was saying in the spiritual world absolute freedom because even gopis envy Krishna, but in a favorable way. Like, sometimes that I heard, but what I mean is in bhakti we have absolute freedom. And when jiva is in bhakti, that is in relation with Krishna favorably, then we have absolute freedom. But that is the when we are only having bhakti, then only we are in spiritual world. So even in that context, we say we have absolute freedom. Otherwise, no.
Okay, thank you. Any other thoughts?
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji. I was going to the point that you're mentioning the discussion between Bhaktisiddhanta and Srila Prabhupada, that freedom from one would mean not the freedom from the other. So I was also thinking on the same lines that freedom probably is my ability to choose my master. And it also goes back to the discussion that you were mentioning earlier, wherein one father said, I want my kid to be doctor, the other said to be engineer, and the third one says, I want my kid to be servant. Not just servant, but the servant of the servant. And everybody was laughing that, why do you say that? And then the answer, because he was a Braj Bihari Prabhu, he said that ultimate master is Krishna, and then there is a Krishna and his devotees and his devotees. So I want my son to be the servant of the servant of the servant. And I think even taking it to the absolute truth in the spiritual world, I think the boundary is always there, Prabhuji. And we have to be bound by those boundaries. But then within that boundary, we have freedom where, we are serving Krishna as his servant. So he is the governor, he is the master, we are the servant. And that is the only relationship. There is no, so to say, peer relationship. And there is one, and then everybody else. So that's where I think it's very well clearly defined, and then there is no infighting. So everybody is in that sense aware and independent.
Thank you. Very good points.
Hare Krishna Prabhu, just a thought came when people walk their dog, it is leashed. So that leash is sometime more or sometime less. So that means the dog is always bound, even though he is free. But again, what Rajesh Prabhu said, in a restricted area, I don't know, Jiva has the same thing. Jiva will be either bind to Krishna, his choice, or bind to Maya, and still he is bound in both conditions.
Yes, thank you. So that was the point that I wanted to make, that actually, so this is the bad news, that there is no freedom. The notion of freedom sometimes gets confused with happiness. And understandably, because there is some correlation, not between freedom and happiness, but between how we choose to exercise our freedom and the consequential happiness. So it does not mean, and we can look at it from a limited constraint, it does not mean that if a person has more freedom, he's automatically happier. Right? So there are some people who say, I don't want to go to Grihastha life. Who wants to go through all these responsibilities of taking care of a family, holding down a job, paying a mortgage? I want to be free. Right? So there are people who actually follow through that. But are they happier? Definitely not. Because there is so much that one gets out of those relationships that nurtures one's happiness. So more freedom does not necessarily mean more happiness. But the right way of exercising freedom definitely results in more happiness. So Pat Prabhu was making this point that if we drive on the right side of the road, we are abiding by the rules of the country, and therefore we are free to drive in the country. If we don't, then we don't get a driver's license and we are not free to drive. In a broader context, that as we make the right choices in terms of where all do we surrender our freedom. So the point over here is not where all do we exercise our freedom, but where all do we surrender our freedom. So what is the freedom I'm surrendering? The freedom that I'm surrendering is, so I might say I want to be free to drive any part of the road I want. On Mondays I want to drive right, Tuesdays I want to drive on the left. Sometimes, so if you're from India, you'll drive in the middle of the road and then figure out which is the bigger car and then go either to the right or the left. So, so that freedom I'm giving up. Because I choose to give up that freedom, I now have the freedom to drive wherever I want. Because I choose to abide by the general legal system of the country, I have the freedom to buy a house, to travel anywhere, to get a job. Why? Because I have chosen to give up my freedom in so many ways. The government has so many rules and regulations. You can do this, you cannot do that. Some of them are commonplace, some of them are circumstantial. But we are very careful, right? When you fill your taxes, then there are so many lines and we very carefully see. So if you look at it at one end, when you're doing your taxes, you're taking money out of your pocket and putting it in the pocket of the government. But you want to make sure that you give all the money that you owe to the government. And for that, you patiently sit and navigate all that arcane rules and regulations. If you're married, if you have dependents, if you have income, if you have dividends, and if you have this, and then you want to make sure that you give them whatever is due. Why? Because by surrendering to those rules and regulations, now you have the freedom that the government offers you. So in the same way, the real freedom that we have is the choice where we relinquish our freedom. If we make that choice correctly, then we will be bestowed the freedom that can give us happiness. So it all comes down to choice. Choice comes down to what? Choice comes down to free will. So we don't have freedom. We have free will. That's the difference between the two. And one of the key verses of that Srila Prabhupada said very often was Nityo Nityanam Chetanas Chetananam Eko Bhavanam Yo Vidadati Kaman. That Nityo Nityanam, that there are, all of us are eternal, Nitya. But there is one who is special. Chetanas Chetananam, all of us are sentient, but there is one who is special. Why? Eko Bhavanam Yo Vidati Kaman. Because he is fulfilling the desires of everybody since time immemorial. As long as we are bound with that relationship, which means forever, our freedom is based on what is defined as the do's and the don'ts by that person who happens to be the personality of Godhead. So if we are able to exercise our free will in making the right choices, then we are able to enjoy the freedom that is bestowed upon us. So contrary to what is said, and this is more of a spiritual perspective, that freedom is a birthright. No, freedom is not your birthright. Because you never had freedom. And you never will have freedom. So how can you exercise that as your birthright? But yes, the freedom to choose is your birthright. Because it is there in the soul. It is what Krishna has given us. Now even that is bestowed, but He has given it us and He'll never take it away from us. He has given us the freedom to choose. That we can choose to believe in Him, we can choose to blaspheme Him, we can choose to follow His primary laws, or we can choose to follow His secondary laws. That is our choice. Now within that range, there are of course degrees of happiness. So the example that Laddu Gopal Prabhu was giving was about an animal that is tied by the rope to the pole. And the length of the rope is the degree of freedom that has been bestowed on that animal based on the choices that was made. Now, of course, in case of animal, that choice has already been made. But even for us, each one of us has a different rope. Right? So, if Steve Jobs, not Steve Jobs, who's the richest person? No, Jeff Bezos. If Jeff Bezos wants to do something, he has $100 billion to make his desire come true. Right? He says that today I would like to go to Vrindavan and do Govardhan Parikrama. Right? Forget about COVID-19 or quarantine or flights are going or not. He'll pick up the phone. There will be a plane ready for him that will take him. And then there he is doing Parikrama. But if you and I have the desire, difficult for us to make happen. He has a longer rope than we do. Bill Gates says, I want to eradicate malaria. And that's what he did. He eradicated malaria. Right? He spent whatever, the several hundreds of millions of dollars. He had that money. And he had the intelligence. But he eradicated it. That was his rope. The reason he had that rope was that at some point of time he made the right choice. And because of that he got a longer rope. So the more choices that we make, the more freedom will be bestowed upon us. But as long as we have an understanding of this notion that freedom is bestowed upon us, it's an oxymoron, because in a way it is coming to us, it has been given to us. Freedom is something that we have, but if we go past that oxymoron, the understanding is that as long as we make the right choices, we will be bestowed by greater and greater levels of freedom. If you look in the spiritual world, so right now, from a material conception, if you look in the spiritual world, there is no freedom. Right? We were once, this is in our early days, we were talking, and this one person says that, Prabhu, what freedom is there in the spiritual world? Morning to evening, they just keep doing Krishna, Krishna, Krishna. They have nothing else to do. What if they want to watch a movie? What if they want to go and have a vacation? I have not seen anybody over there having a vacation or watching a movie or having fun amongst themselves. All they do from morning to evening is Krishna, Krishna, Krishna. So if you look at it, there's no freedom over there. The moment you're in the spiritual world, you say that your mood changes from Krishna, Krishna, Krishna to me, 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 what happens? You're kicked out. You're kicked out, you're given a material body that is a bag of suffering and pain, and then you're going through this cycle of birth and death. Why? because you violated the rules over there, so to speak. So even so, we are aspiring to go to the spiritual world, right? So I say to you today, Prabhu, that from tomorrow onwards, 24/7, just Krishna. Right? So how many of us will raise our hands? Experientially, I'm saying that, I say that from tomorrow, 24/7. And not just 24/7, but 24/7 times eternity. So it's not 5 days a week, it's not just weekends, but 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the rest of eternity. It's just Krishna, Krishna, Krishna. We won't. Difficult for us. But yet the scriptures say that all of us should aspire to go to the spiritual world. And the reason they say is because that choice of us giving up the freedom is the one that will give us the most amount of happiness. So one of the point that was made over here was, I'm not sure who said that, but I have it written over here, is that freedom is the ability to experience happiness. So in a strict sense, maybe not, but from a perspective that choice that we make, if it results in us experiencing happiness, regardless of how it impinges on our freedom, is the right choice to make. Because essentially, as jivas, we are not... so what would be the Sanskrit of freedom?
Swecha.
I'm sorry?
Swecha, Prabhuji.
Swa-ichha. Swa-ichha. Yes, thank you, Prabhu. So as souls, we are Sat Chitananda, right? We are not Swa-ichhamai. That is not the constitutional position of the soul. When we look at all the scriptures, when they try to define the nature of the soul, the desires of the souls, what makes the soul unique, what is the one factor that comes up over and over again consistently? What is the intrinsic nature of the soul? That it is Anandamai. It is not Swechhamai. Soul has no desire for freedom. It's not part of her intrinsic makeup. If the soul was intrinsically desiring freedom, the structure of the universe would have been different. The whole structure of the creation would have been different. But no, the soul has no desire for freedom. The desire of the soul is to experience happiness. So there's somebody speaking in Bengali, which I'm guessing is Piali and Somya. So you may want to mute your... Thank you, Prabhu. So the nature of the soul is to desire happiness. But freedom is a close cousin. So the path to happiness goes through one gate, which is how do we choose to exercise our freedom? And based on that choice, we can either experience eternal happiness or eternal unhappiness. Which is why freedom and happiness are considered as, because they're sitting next to one another, they're considered close to one another. This is also the reason why when we take to devotional service, the first thing that we give up is our freedom. Because we made the wrong choices. When we exercised our choice of freedom, we exercised it in the wrong way. So when we do Sana Vaidhi Bhakti, that's why it's called Vaidhi. Vaidhi is rules and regulations. That do this, don't do this. Chant 16 rounds. Don't eat meat. Don't have intoxication. Don't do this. If you look at the nectar of instruction, the first 4 verses are essentially 24 items of do's and don'ts. Atyara prayashascha, prajalpad, that don't over endeavor for something. Do not be greedy. Do not associate with worldly minded people. Then dadati pratiganati guyamakhyati prachati. Associate with devotees, serve the devotees. So it's all about do's and don'ts. All of them are designed to restrict your freedom. Sometimes when people come to Krishna consciousness, one of the first things, or some of them will say, that I do not believe in organized religion. And the reason that they say to it is because they do not like the regulative aspects of the religion. They say, I understand that you have to be good and kind. Now, of course, what is good and what is kind is subjective. But the idea is that they are saying that whatever I want to do should be based on my own understanding. I do not want to subject myself to something that is being exposed, that is being imposed externally upon me. And at the end of the day, based on our choices, so we have no freedom anyway. But based on our choices, what we are doing is that we are trading one kind of our so what would be the antonym to freedom? Not slavery, but what would be a suitable antonym to freedom?
Restriction, Prabhuji.
Yeah, I was thinking that, but something more appropriate. Freedom, absence of freedom, imposition. Bondage. Okay, let's go with restriction for now. So we are essentially trading one kinds of restrictions with another kind. That's all that we are doing. Again, this is from Prabhupada's pastimes. That
you can use bondage to freedom.
Bondage, yeah, can use bondage. So there was a there was a devotee, very very strong built, well and halki palki, very strong. So devotees would get him to do all the hard work, the menial, not the menial work, but one of his service was that when the supply truck would come, so they would come with all those boxes of vegetables for cooking, vegetables and all that. So his work was that he would pick it up, put it there, and because he was big and strong, he could do it. But he was very upset about it, saying that I'm tired of being used as an ox. And all you do is ask me to pick up these heavy stuffs here and there. He got so angry that he left the temple. He went out, he moved out, and then after some time, one of the devotees, he was he was out there, he was going shopping there, something like whatever, one of the predecessors of Home Depot, and saw the same person over there and doing the same kind of job. That he was essentially picking up stuff and putting it over here and there. So he said, Prabhuji, if you have to do this, just come and do it in the temple. Why do you have to do it over here? And he said, yes, you make a good point there. So somehow, because of whatever, his karma, whatever, he was destined to do this work, but then he had the choice that do I do it for Krishna or do I do it for XYZ? And he was doing it for Krishna, and he felt that it was an imposition, and then he was doing it somewhere else, and then he came back and he did it for Krishna. Same work, same lack of choice. He didn't like it, but he had to do it for whatever reason, but much more enjoyable. So if we are able to exercise our freedom in terms of making the right choices, that is the extent of freedom that we have. The more right choices we make, the more happiness we will get out of it. And the ultimate right choice that we make is if we decide to go back to resume our service to Krishna. And there, the happiness will be absolute. So I will stop at this point, see if there are any follow-up thoughts, discussions.
Just one question, Prabhu. In this realm, where do we understand moksha? Which is a kind of freedom, we say, from birth and death?
Thank you, Prabhu. That's a good question. So I guess we have already established the fact that the freedom that we have is basically that of choice, of what is it that we want to do. That establishes our goal. So there is one person who might say that I would like freedom from suffering, which means that I would like wealth, I would like fame or opulence. What's the choice that person will make? He will become pious, right? He will give in charity. He will become truthful. He will become strongly situated in the mode of goodness, because that is the consequence of the mode of goodness, that one gets all these opulences. So that's the choice that person has made, that my choice is that I would like this happiness. Similarly, there is a person that might say that I have to get freedom from this cycle of repeated birth and death. And what will that person do? So that person will follow the path of moksha, whether it is through the pursuit of jnana or astang, and that person will make that choice to reach that destination. And there are other person who might say that I would choose to serve Krishna, and then he would follow the path of bhakti. So ultimately what we have is the freedom of choice. Based on the freedom of choice, we are going to follow a path, and based on that path we are going to get a certain result from it. So these are all on the positive side. A person says, I want to be happy, I want to be liberated. And there are some people who might make a choice in the negative conception, like the asuras, right? For them, freedom is that it's coming from a platform of envy. That my choice is that everybody is scared of me, that everybody is weaker than me. I'm able to defeat everybody, like Hiranyakashipu. That was the choice. That was the choice that he made, and then whatever he gets out of it, he gets. So the majority of the scriptures are there to guide us in making the right choice. So they establish the goal for us, which is Ananda, which is happiness. And then what they try to give us is that what are the choices that you can make to reach that goal. Freedom is not a choice. Freedom is not a goal. It's a means to an end. The goal is or what the scriptures would like us to subscribe to is that the goal is that of eternal happiness, absolute happiness. And what is the choices that you are free to make in order to achieve that goal. Prabhupada would give that example that you have the choice to go, if you're going from one point to another, you have the choice to go by an aeroplane, by a bullock cart, by walking. Once you made that choice, then you're there for the ride. You get on the plane, you can't say, I want to walk right now. So, the point that he made was that when we get this human form of life, important for us to make the right choice. Because once we make that choice, then even though we have the freedom to change it, but it becomes more and more difficult. Because we start acting in that conception. Our desires, they align according to that conception. Our definition of happiness also becomes customized to that conception. So that's why Srila Prabhupada would say that most important thing for you is to establish the right goal and then work towards it. Thank you, Prabhu. Any other thoughts, questions, comments?
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji. Just a comment, Prabhuji. Like, I wanted to thank you for today's class. Like, I am feeling that this class is so important because initially, as you started off, and reasonably concluding that there is nothing called freedom, it was kind of disappointing and not feel like accepting, but you give all the reason why it is not so, and we are seeing experientially too. But later, what gave me great solace is like, what all we are trying to do with that freedom is to get happiness. That, you gave that scriptural reference, Anandamayi, not Svechamayi. So I could also relate, although I am following, still I was kind of having, but seeing the modern society, they are, all they want is like freedom. Freedom is the most widely used and trying to practice. And I could see the problem with, freedom as our main objective. So that also kind of helps me that to have the right distinction between freedom and happiness. So,
good. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so if there are no more questions, then... Yes.
That's not a question, but I think this is giving us a segue for another lecture on choice. When we talk about we have the freedom to make choice, but then how to make right choice then? Because that's where the problem will start. Because when we make bad choices, we end up into a not free, but into a bondage.
You're right, Prabhu. It's a natural segue into that. Once given establishing the fact that you have freedom of choice, how do you make sure that you don't misuse that freedom? Right.
So, Prabhu, in a way, today it kind of is established that we don't per se have freedom, right?
Yes.
So we are just a function of somebody else's directions. Is that what you're trying to say also in a nutshell? So one is we don't have freedom. So does that mean we are just a product of somebody else's choices and directions and rules and guidelines?
Yes and no. So I think the point that I was making is that we have the freedom of choice. But that's the only freedom that we have. After that, it's a zero-sum game. Right? So you can think of it this way, that so in ancient India, they used to have the Swayamvar ceremony, where the woman would choose her husband, right? So she had the choice of picking her husband. But when she picked her husband, then she was that person's wife. There was no choice after that. So we have the choice of doing anything that we want. So we have full freedom of choice. But after having chosen something, we have no freedom.
Okay. So in Advaita, we have a freedom of choice, but not of the consequences of the choice.
Yeah, exactly. So it's freedom with consequences.
Yes. That's probably a better way to put it. Right? Because if you look at it, that based on what you choose, you are forced to live according to certain rules and regulations. You choose to live in the material world, right? That's your choice. Now you are bound by the law of karma. Very, very restrictive. Good thing, bad thing, etc. No freedom over there. You can't say that I am no longer bound by karma. I choose not to be bound by karma. Not going to happen. Or you choose to serve Krishna. There also you're bound. That the understanding is that the purpose of the jiva is to serve Krishna. Now, why is that given as a superior choice? Because of two reasons. One, because it resonates with the natural propensity of the soul. And because it resonates with the natural propensity of the soul, you experience a lot more happiness. So that is why that is recommended as the choice of, or as the recommended choice. But I like the statement that you made, that absolute freedom is just a concept. So that was that kind of encapsulates the essence of what I was trying to say. So saying by saying that it's just a concept, the communication that is going along with it is that it is theoretical. From a practical perspective, does not really exist. Okay, so we can stop here and see if we have our group of devotees to do the Narsingadev prayer.
Kesha?
I'm just washing my hands. I'll fix the shoe.
Okay.
Your shirt.